Typically, when we think about research studies, we tend to think about experimental studies. We'll discuss experiments here shortly, but this lecture focuses on non-experimental methods. There's a couple different kinds we'll discuss. The first one is the case study. And a case study provides kind of an in-depth analysis of behavior of one person or maybe even a small number of people. It's often used, in fact, really commonly in medicine, law, business, and things like that. Psychologists often use case studies in situations where maybe there aren't large numbers of participants available for us, or when a particular participant possesses really unique characteristics. Perhaps they have a particular disease or a specific injury or something of that sort. And a case study will typically involve interviews, background records, observation, personality tests, all kinds of things to understand that one person or that one case really, really well. A classic example of a case study is from H.M. In 1953, H.M. are actually the initials of the person, Henry Molaison. In 1953, he was a 27-year-old man who had epilepsy, and that epilepsy was so severe that he really needed to have brain surgery in an effort to stop his seizures. The surgery removed parts of both his left and right temporal lobes, including parts of the hippocampus on each side. This radical treatment helped him control his seizures, which was absolutely wonderful. On the other hand, it left him with an amnesic syndrome that persisted until he died at the age of 82. So again, that's the difference between 27 or 28 years old when he had this surgery done and he died at 82. During all of those years, he was studied, and we learned lots of things about him that prompted an awful lot of research on memory loss in other people after medial temporal lobe damage. So that's the example of a case study that really launched all kinds of research. For years and years and years, people relied on research from HM. And we wouldn't have gotten nearly as far as we did without this one person who had really a surgery that isn't done very often. So we needed to look at that one person. You can't go off and just do those kinds of surgeries on people just to see how they'll work out. So they had to rely on HM to learn as much as they possibly could. That's not the only kind of non-experimental method that's out there too, though I should say naturalistic observation is really useful as well. So lots of times we're interested in learning about larger groups of people than are possible with a case study. But again, maybe it's still not possible to do an experiment with them. So a naturalistic observation offers an in-depth study of a phenomenon in its natural setting. And that enables us to strengthen our ability to apply the results to a general population because it happens in a really realistic and naturalistic sort of context. It also gives us the advantage of observing people in their natural everyday circumstances. And you really can't do that nearly as well in an experiment. And in fact, in an experiment, our job is to make things, except for the one variable we're studying, as sort of constant as possible. And of course, that's not the real world. Researchers in the field can examine behavior as it unfolds in naturalistic observation. The downside is they run the risk of influencing the behavior they're observing. So here's an example of Jane Goodall, the anthropologist, observing the world of chimpanzees. So she got a chance to see lots and lots of, and years of behavior among chimpanzees and other apes and so forth. However, she ran the risk of them certainly, of course, knowing she was there and them changing their behavior because they sort of got the sense they were being observed and so, or some other way kind of sensed her presence. So it's really useful in the sense that you get a lot of realistic activity in the organism's natural habitat. But on the other hand, you may actually disturb that habitat and as a result disturb their behavior as a result. There's other kinds of non-experimental methods. Surveys are an example and a great way to get lots of information relatively quickly. So you ask lots of people questions about their attitudes and behavior and so forth, which provides lots of great information cheaply and quickly. Can be done by internet, paper, pencil, etc. I ended up I hit the wrong button. Sorry about that. You, in surveys, need appropriate samples or a subset of the population being studied. They also require large samples that are typical or representative of the population which you describe. And the thing is, if you're not really careful to get just the right population, then you can run into trouble. So for example, in fact, this is kind of the classic example. If you were conducting a telephone survey and you excluded people without landlines, well, then you would only have people who could afford things like cell phones and who were technologically savvy enough to use them and things like that. As a result, you would leave out a fairly sizable chunk of the population. It used to be just the opposite. People would do surveys only with landlines and never sort of tap into the people who used only their cell phones. So that switched recently. The other problem with surveys, it's not the worst problem in the world, but it makes surveys not perfect, of course, is that surveys use self-report. So results can be influenced by people's tendency to want to appear socially appropriate. If you start asking them some pretty personal questions, it's possible you're going to get the answer they want you to know about as opposed to the answer that's really true.